Let's look at the raster source editor in ProRaster. I'm running ProRaster Premium. So if I create an algorithm, in an algorithm we need to connect the components to rasters that will get rendered. But in ProRaster we don't refer to rasters directly, we refer to a more abstract concept called a raster source. The advantage of a raster source is that you can firstly specify more than one raster in a raster source. So for example, if you have 300 TIFF files which are all imagery and you want to display them all, in ProRaster you don't need to create 300 image layers and connect each one of those image layers to an individual TIFF file. You can create a single image layer and then create a raster source that links to those 300 TIFF files, and then connect the image layer to that raster source. So there's some convenience involved in being able to do that. And secondly, a raster source can have additional information in it, which is used to tell the raster engine how to treat those rasters in the raster source if for some reason you need it to act in some way that is different to the default behavior. So there's a couple of advantages there for raster sources. To see what raster sources you have in your system, you go to the raster source editor. And today I've got a completely blank slate. I've deleted all my raster sources and there's nothing to see. So we're starting from scratch. Now raster sources come in two flavors. The first one is permanent. The second one is temporary. So let's create a permanent raster source. So I go up to the Add a New Raster Source button, press the button, and add a new raster source. Now I need to give it a name. All resources in ProRaster have to be named, and within a resource type they must be unique names. So I'm going to call this Merit DEM. I'll hit the tick button to accept that name, and you can see that it's now reflected in this list. Now I'm going to add a file to this raster source. So we'll go into Merit. Here's our Merit DM, the one, this raster we've seen many times. And so we've got a new path here, and here's the list of files that we have in our raster source. We have one, and if I click on it, then this preview window becomes active and it renders the raster using a standard default algorithm. You can zoom and pan in this thing. It just gives you a quick view of what you're looking at. So that's our raster source. In order to save it, I now have to hit OK. If I go back in there, I can see that that raster source has been saved. So that's a permanent raster source. And the next time I run ProRaster, that information is still going to be there and I'm going to be able to reuse it. So I can use that raster source in algorithms time after time, as many times as I want. Now the other concept is a temporary raster source. And temporary raster sources arise in two ways. Firstly, you can load an algorithm. Now in the algorithm there will be raster source definitions. The system will look at those definitions, and if it can match them to permanent raster sources that it's got stored, then it will register that that is a permanent raster source. If it doesn't match any raster sources, then it will store it as a temporary raster source. And when you unload the algorithm or close ProRaster, then that raster source will go away and you won't see it again. So they can come about by loading algorithms. Secondly, they can come about by creating algorithms from rasters. So if, for example, I take a raster like this Jebco raster, for example, and drag and drop it into ProRaster. So now I have a temporary raster source. If I go into the raster source editor, I can see that I have my merit DEM down here. That's the permanent raster source that I just created. And up here above this dotted line will be my temporary raster sources, and here's the one that I've just loaded. So temporary raster sources can be created by either dragging and dropping a raster onto ProRaster, which creates a new algorithm to display that raster. Creating a new algorithm for raster from the open button does the same thing. New algorithm for raster source, for raster GHX will do the same thing. If I create a new algorithm and I go into one of the components and I use this browse button to load a raster. So this will now be a temporary raster source. So there's a variety of ways that they can come about. So let's go into the raster source editor. Close a few of these things off. And let's create some raster sources. So I've already demonstrated merit DEM, so that's a single raster source. What if I want to create multiple, a raster source with multiple rasters in it? So let's create a new permanent raster source. I'm going to call this mine operation ECW. Hit return and that will accept that. Now I want to put in multiple rasters, so I can go add a new file and I'll come up to my rasters aerial. So I have here 3 ECWs, so I can select all 3 of them like that, and now I have 3 paths in here with file names, and that results in 3 rasters. Click on these one at a time and you can see that they're all ECW imagery. The other way that I can go about doing that, if I delete all those rasters, is I can use a file browser and select my files and drag and drop them onto the raster source editor, and now I have my 3 rasters again. So let's hit OK. Now if I create a new image algorithm, go into there, select this mine operation ECW that I just created, and you can see then I have the 3 rasters rendered in the one layer. You can also select multiple rasters by using a wildcard. So I'm going to add a new raster source. I'm going to call this my TIFF collection. And they're going to be TIFF files. We'll do a star.tiff, and then I'm going to open a folder. So I go up to here. So select this folder, TIFF collection, and you can see in here the path is now star.tiff. But the file list has got 4 TIFF files in it, so it found 4 TIFF files in that directory. So I hit OK. Now if I create a new lookup table algorithm, connect to that TIFF collection, and there I have my 4 rasters rendered. Now you see that they all have different color stretch, so you're going to want to use some kind of transformation that applies equally to them all. So if we do like a manual color stretch, you can see the 4 TIFF files there. So let's go back into the raster source editor to show you a few more things. So we'll just review some of these buttons. So firstly, you can add a new raster source. Secondly, we can delete a raster source. So you select one of these, hit delete, and it will go away. You then have to hit OK to make sure that that delete is actually executed. If you hit cancel, then everything will revert to what it was before. This is a clone button. So you can clone the existing raster source. The major reason to want to do that is if you have a temporary raster source, say you've just dragged a file onto ProRaster from the file browser, and so you've opened a raster, created some algorithm. Now you want to turn that into a permanent raster source, so you can clone it with this button and create a permanent raster source from that temporary raster source. Over here we have a delete all raster source button. So if you hit that one accidentally, make sure you go and hit cancel to make sure that those changes are discarded. So when you add a new raster source, you must give it a name, and this is very important. It must be a unique name. So the first thing you do after creating a new raster source is you come in and edit this name, and if it's unique, you'll get a tick here in this on this button. And once you've finished editing it, you can either just hit return, which you can do in all ProRaster dialogs, in order to indicate to the application that you've finished editing some text. You can just hit return, or you can click on this button, and that will save the name. So down here we have our raster files. Perhaps we'll go to so let's go to MeritDM. So we have this file. Now when we click on it, some other things become available. Firstly, we have our preview, and it's going to preview the default field and band. So that's probably going to be the first field and the first band. Depends on what kind of field type it is and so forth. But if that's not what you want to see, you can come into this button. It's telling that it's using the default field 0 and band DEM, or you can come into manual settings, and then you can select a field and select a band. So perhaps if we go back to the TIFF, not this one, the ECW, going to here, manual settings, you might be able to select one of these other bands like the green band and see a different preview. Let's just go back to default. So that's your preview. Over here we have some buttons for information. So when you hit the information button, you'll get a report which you can scroll through. You can copy and paste out of here. So let's take a bit of a closer look at it. So this is an information report for this raster. This is the driver that it's using. Here's the information about this raster. The name of it, a number of fields, the coordinate system of the raster, the size of the raster, information about field 0, the number of bands, the name of it, the cell size and the origin coordinate, what kind of compression it's using, and various other information, including the valid cell range and the valid cell coordinate range. Then you get information about the bands, so the data type of the band, the name of the band, various other things. And then rasters also have events, and all rasters have at least one event, which will be a default event. So there'll be some information about that. So how much information you see in that report depends on this drop down. So if we go brief, then we get just the very basic information about a raster. Field, band, how big it is, origin coordinate and cell size. Standard, we just saw before. If we go for detailed, then we start to get more information. So now, for example, in the driver capabilities, we get all this information about what the driver can or cannot do. We get information about what other files are associated with the raster, tab files, GHX files, and so forth. We get information about the overview, tile sizes and underview tile sizes. If there's metadata associated with the raster, then that metadata gets reflected. So here, for example, we have metadata about the origin of this DEM, the license agreement for using the DEM, data sharing policy of the author of this raster, then field and ban information, and then overview levels. If we go for complete information, then we get a much bigger report. Now, in addition to all those other things that we saw, we also get statistics. So here we have, for example, spatial statistics for field 0 and band 0. The total number of samples. How many of those samples are valid? How many are invalid? The minimum value, the maximum value, so these are our summary statistics. We've got the mean, the variance, standard deviation, signal to noise. And then based on the distribution statistics, we'll get some quartiles. So we have the lower quartile and the upper quartile, the interquartile range. The median value and the mode. Here are the spatial statistics, which are used for doing the shadow, hill shading. And then you'll get the histogram. So all of the histogram data is in here, and of course that is usually a fair amount of data. And depending on what kind of data you're looking at, that histogram information will have a different format. So that's a complete report on everything that is inside that raster. So over here we have a duplicate of the currently selected path or file. That's for more advanced applications. We'll talk about that in another video. Now up here we have a few buttons. We have our validate button, clean, prepare, and advanced. So validate, so all of these things run, well, these first three buttons run operations. So if I hit the validate button, it will execute this operation to validate the source files in that raster. So in other words, to make sure that they exist and to make sure that everything that you need to efficiently and render those rasters at high quality is available. So that means it needs statistics, it means it needs overview pyramids. So if those things don't exist, then in this report you'll get some information saying that they don't exist. If you want to regenerate things like overview pyramids, then what you can do first is clean the rasters. So this will delete all of the ancillary files associated with that rasters. So you can clean the cache files, the cache and GHX files, and the cache and GHX and tab files. And then you press the button and it will execute that clean operation. So let's do a clean now. And it'll tell you a total of 1 file is about to be permanently deleted. Do you want to proceed? And I'll say, no, I don't want to. So in this case, it found the GHX file and it was planning to delete that, but I cancelled, so it didn't do so. If you want to build pyramids and compute statistics, then you can hit the prepare button. And again, there's a drop list here. So you can either favor speed or favor quality. So when the overview pyramid raster is built, data has to be stored in that raster, and it will use some compression codecs, and which will be different depending on whether it's continuous data or classified data or whether it's imagery data. Now usually by default it will use codecs that are fast but not particularly efficient. In other words, it will favor speed, whereas you can specify that you would prefer to favor quality, and then it will use a higher quality compression codecs. Might take a little bit longer to build those rasters, those overview pyramids, but at the end of the day they might be smaller because the compression is better. And with the case of imagery, by specifying favor quality, you're saying, well, I want higher quality imagery. So it might use PNG, for example, instead of JPEG. So you'll get lossless compression of your imagery in the pyramid rather than lossy compression. And then there's the advanced button, and I'll cover this in another video, but if you open it up, this brings up the driver preferences dialog. So these are settings that we can apply to the rasters in that raster source when they're opened to change the way that the engine opens that raster source. So that's a basic introduction to the raster source editor.